Hi guys, just got a quick little tip here on how to bench test a starter. Sometimes when you're dealing with the starter and you're questioning it, sometimes it's really hard to get to the starter terminals. This thing could be buried. Maybe you got to take a whole bunch of stuff off, and you know what, by that point when you finally get to the starter, to try and put everything back so you can at least get some kind of testing on it, sometimes it's just easier and cheaper just to throw a new starter on there, right? You got a 10-15-year-old vehicle, chances are your starter is kind of worn out anyways, right? Sometimes it's worth it just throwing one in there. But it's really nice in that case, if you can't get to it and you can't do the testing very easily, it's nice to throw it on the bench and test it yourself, because if you can see it absolutely failing, you can feel a better degree of confidence that it really is just the starter, and just throwing one in will fix your problem so you don't have to go to the wiring. If you bench test it, now obviously it's unloaded, it's not the same as if it's loaded turning an engine, so the motor here itself won't have the same strain. If you bench test it and everything works 100%, you cannot get it to fail. That doesn't mean it's good, it could still be bad. Sometimes when starters go, it takes a while for them to actually act up. They might be fine for a few days, might even be a week or so. But the point is if you bench test it and everything seems good and you really can't get it to act up, then at that point you want to start thinking about the wiring, the connections, the main power, the starter terminal, you know, checking them when the key's in the on position and the circuits are loaded. So you want to check that sort of stuff. Sometimes that's the only way you can really check it, is once you've got everything apart, rather than just throwing one back in, putting everything back together and hoping for the best. But in this case here, yes, it's a bad starter. We did a bench test, it failed. So let me show you how to check that out. Okay, so I'll show you how to make connections to bench test a starter. First off, starters are case grounded, so you do want to hook up a ground. I like using an eyelet style with a bolt and nut to hold it. You can use a clamp, but keep in mind when you activate this thing, it's going to kick and it's going to buck, so a lot of times the clamps like to fall off. So I like to use an eyelet and a bolt and nut. But either way, you attach a ground lead to the battery negative. Now, on the starter solenoid, there's 3 connection points. The one at the top, this is the one that is your big power input. Then the one down here, this is the end of the solenoid to the starter motor. So normally you won't have to attach to that, but there is a thing we can do to that. And then this guy right here, this is your starter solenoid wires. This is your switch. So what I do for bench testing, I'll hook a full-time power to the power input, just kind of like how it is in the vehicle. And again, you can use a clamp, or in this case here, I've got ones made up that have eyelets on it. So I just put the original nut all the way down and it's holding it there, and it is attached to a battery positive. So then we also put, if we want to test the whole thing, we then at this point we can put battery positive to the solenoid wire. Now if you're testing it on a bench, obviously you want to make sure that this is not, if you're on a metal bench, you want to make sure that your solenoid contact is not touching the metal bench, because remember, this is case grounded, you don't want to short. I'm using a power probe, so if it did have a short, you'd just pop the circuit breaker and you just push this to re-trip it. Otherwise, you know, if you used just a jumper wire, you can melt your wire, all that sort of stuff. So make sure it's lifted up, so when you apply power, or even this power right here, make sure that none of those can touch the case, because that's a short. So if we want to test the whole thing, what we do is we go all the way up to here. Our power probe shows green, so that shows that it is getting the path through the starter solenoid windings to ground. So that means we're on there, we're making contact. So if we push the button to supply power to the solenoid, not only should that drive pop out, but everything should spin. So let's give it a shot. There we go. Now there's other things we can do. If we supply power just to here, then what will happen is our starter motor will spin but we won't be engaging the solenoid, so the drive won't kick out, because the solenoid, not only does it bridge the gap of the heavy current from here to power your motor, but it also kicks the drive out. So this, by applying power here, we'll see the motor spin but not kick out. So let's give it a shot. Oh, great. And of course this is a bad starter, so now it decided to kick out. So I'll show you that it is in fact kicking out. We go back to the solenoid wire and it's dead. Now, usually the problem's with the solenoid itself. So tap test, right? Put it over here. Let's give it a tap. Of course, you don't want to do that to a good starter. So we'll spin it. Okay. There we go. Now, the other thing we can do, we disconnect this. So if we have a case ground, we don't supply power to the power input, because I have that disconnected. Now we just supply power just to the solenoid, and we'll see the drive kick in and out, but not spin. It's spinning a tiny bit because a little bit of the power from here is connecting through here, so it is able to spin a little bit, but it's not the same as this guy. So you can see that's spinning a lot faster. Now, if we're bench testing a starter, we're not really rebuilding the solenoids anymore. So basically it's a whole unit, black box. You provide it as things. So you provide a power up here, you provide a ground here, then you provide a switched power, or you can use a jumper wire, to the solenoid. And not only should this kick out, but it should also spin. So we saw that that's in fact what it was doing. And we also saw a time when it stopped working. So why would you want to do this? Well, sometimes in the vehicle, sometimes it's so hard to gain access to this that you can't really do your testing in the vehicle, which is really the ideal place to do this, because this of course is not loaded. So we can test kind of the solenoid, we can test that yes, it's able to spin, but we can't test, is it intact enough to be able to turn an engine over, right? But as you saw before, usually when you have a faulty starter, like right now, usually you can get it to act up just on a bench without a load. Give it a tap again, and we'll go back to here. So by doing that, that ensures that we know 100% for certain that yes, we do have a faulty starter. Because what happens on a vehicle such as this Dodge Dart, when it's difficult to get to in the vehicle, you can't do your testing in the vehicle. So you say, you know what, it's a 10, 15-year-old vehicle, it probably needs a starter anyways, or at least it's an original starter. The starter's old, it's got some wear. Let's just try and put a starter in there. That's going to be the fix 90% of the time. Well, if you got everything open, you can finally get to your main power as well as your starter feed. If you have a problem, if your starter's not the problem, then then's would be the time to be able to do your testing. So what you can do in a case like this, we just said, you know what, hey, we can't get to the starter, we're just going to throw one in. It's nice to be able to do the bench test, because then we found it act up, so we know, yes, it's just going to be a starter. If we couldn't get it to act up, then you want to invest the effort of doing testing at the wires when you got things open. You kind of rig things back together, plug in things that you've unplugged to gain access, all that sort of stuff. And in place of the starter, you can put a high current test light. Obviously, it's not the same as a starter, but at least lets you know. You can put the key on. Do you have the starter, the solenoid terminal? Does that light up when you put it to the start position? Does your main power, does that still stay as a main power when you put some current through it in the start position? You can do those kinds of tests rather than just saying, okay, you know what, we can't get to it, it's difficult to get to, let's throw a starter in there and we'll hope for the best, right? So sometimes it is nice to do a bench test if you can't do it in the vehicle very easily. Okay, so this is how you bench test a starter. Now, of course, if you have the opportunity, it's always best to test it in the vehicle. Now, quickest, easiest thing you can do if you have a starter that's kind of intermittently failing is they will fail on a prolonged crank. So what you have to do is disable it from firing, particularly disable the fuel from spraying. Easiest way to do that, if the vehicle has it, is clear flood mode. Hold your foot down on the accelerator the whole way, crank it. Now, keep in mind, not all vehicles have clear flood mode. So if you do this, be prepared. If it starts, for whatever reason, make sure you get your foot off that gas pedal as fast as possible. A lot of vehicles do have this, and if you push that down, it won't start. Awesome. If that doesn't work and it does start, then what you want to do is you want to find some way of disabling fuel. Not just pulling the fuel pump relay, because you know what, there's still lots of residual pressure. You'll have to run the ever-living snot out of it for quite a while before you can get rid of all of that. You want to disable fuel injectors. So you can pull a fuel injector fuse. If they're easy enough to get to, you can unplug them all, something like that. And then you crank. Now, book says don't crank a starter for longer than 30 seconds or so. Personally, I like to go no less or no more than 15 seconds. But what will happen is, if you have a failing starter that's intermittently not working, you crank it for a long time, and then after 10 seconds or so, you'll crank, and just kind of die out. Then you know you have a bad starter. You could have other things. If you turn the key and you hear a click, but nothing else, it doesn't start. Well, more often than not, that's bad starter, but it can also be a connection issue or wiring issue, not getting enough voltage to the starter. If you turn the key, you hear nothing, and then you turn it again, then it fires right up. Well, that could be anything. You could have a starter, you could have wiring, you could have connection, you could have a terminal, you could have an ignition switch, and, right? So, if you want to test the starter, really the ideal way, the best way is to test the starter in the vehicle. Now, of course, you can't always get to these things, as I said, but if you can, that's the ideal time. So all you need is your simple test light. So you put it on the main power and see if she lights or not. That's not good enough though. You need to put it on there and then turn the key to the crank position. This wire is a really big fat cable. You could have a bad connection at the battery. You could have a bad terminal, you could have corrosion there, you could have a bad wire, it could be damaged somewhere. Could have the connection, the terminal right here could be bad, and, right? Now what can happen is that bad wire, that bad connections could very well be capable of handling enough current to light this, but not enough to run the starter. So you need to test it in the crank position. If it lights up in the off position, then you go to crank and it kicks out, then you know you have a bad connection prior to the starter, and you gotta go dig that out. If you hold it on the main terminal in the crank position and she lights really good and stays lit, then hey, you know you don't have a battery feed issue to the starter. You can move to the solenoid wire, right? So likewise, well, this one here should only light up in the start position, but if it lights nice and good, then hey, you know your connections are good, you don't have a wiring issue. Now that doesn't mean you have a bad starter, because there's one other thing you have to do first before you rule out the starter and put a new one in there. Don't forget to make sure, does the engine turn, right? It would not be the first time that a starter's been put in a seized engine. Heck, I've even done it before. Now, in my defense, the vehicle that I worked on was a 3-year-old Mercedes ML 350, I think. The diesel, the 3-liter diesel. It had like 60,000 kilometers on it. I didn't think that it could be a bad engine, but if it were lucky, maybe it got 2 oil changes in its life. The stuff was molasses. That one sucked because that's not a pleasant starter to put in, and of course then I had to take it back out. It's awfully embarrassing to put a starter in a seized engine. So don't forget, make sure the engine turns over. Make sure to not just rotate the crank once, but rotate it twice in case you have a valve issue. And you know what, if you don't pay attention to, if you don't mark it, if you don't pay attention to exactly where the rotations are, just keep rotating it for a while. If you rotate smooth, then hey, great, throw a starter in there, you're done. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention is, on this style starter, right, that has a blade terminal, one of these kind of guys, make sure, regardless of whatever style terminal it is, make sure that your terminal is not corroded to all heck and it's clean, right? You know, if they're ring terminals, always get a little bit of the sandpaper, scuff them up, clean them up a little bit. On these guys here, if the terminal is nice and clean, I'll always go in there with a screwdriver or something and try and tighten that up a little bit. I've found this a lot on Chrysler products, that these things loosen off because what happens is the terminal, the harness attached to the terminal kind of pulls on it a little bit. And then as the engine torques, it kind of pulls it a little bit and it spreads this. Now I've noticed that a lot of times, and typically what happens is you go to start it, nothing. You go to start it, nothing, 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 and then hey, it'll fire up and maybe it's good for a few days. But what'll happen is, without necessarily a rhyme or reason, it may or may not start for numerous times, but it won't hiccup, it won't cough, it won't nothing. It's just nothing, and then it'll start up, and when it starts, it's just perfect. That's the sort of thing that I encounter when these blade terminals spread. Now, I don't like replacing them if it can be avoided, because typically you don't have access to the harness or access to much of a harness. So you're limited to where you can put your splice, and typically you end up having to put your splice in less than ideal spot, and if it's somewhere that's at a bend, well, it's just gonna break again, right? Now, if you have access to a lot of harness and you can put your splice in a nice spot that's not gonna flex, you can secure it, all that sort of stuff, then hey, sure, it's always good to replace it with something new. But I try not to replace them. If they're kind of spread a little bit, I'll just tighten them up a little bit, crowd them on there. I want to make sure the sucker's really tight going on. If they're ring terminals, typically you don't have that issue, but yeah, I'll scuff them up and I'll make sure they're clean. And that's a starter, right? For the most part, nice and straight and simple. Some are pretty unpleasant to get to, some are nice. What can you do? So just wanted to pass on a couple little tips and tricks that I've kind of learned on the way to help me out. If you work at a large shop, typically most large shops, they got the big AVR machines, and you know they'll do the load test on the battery, they'll do the starter test, they'll check for starter current, all this sort of stuff. And if you read the book, it'll tell you something like an engine should use 40 amps per cylinder. So you know what, a 4-cylinder will be, say, 160 amps, a 6-cylinder 240 amps, something like that. I don't like that. I always try to tell people, you know what, don't try to remember silly things like that, because you know what, the starter current depends on a lot of things. You know, it depends on engine compression, it depends on starter design, what kind of gear reduction you have, it depends on the state of your battery, all sorts of things. You know, do you have thick oil in there? Do you have thin synthetic oil in there? Is it hot? Is it cold? All kinds of things can affect starter current. I don't believe in looking at a plain number and saying, yes, that's a good starter, or no, that's not a good starter. Do you know what a good starter is? There's only one definition of a good starter. And it's the only definition that the customer cares about. Will it start the vehicle each and every time? If it does, as far as the customer is concerned, it's a good starter. Bit of a rant. I don't like those AVR machines. I also don't like those battery testers that just kind of battery analyzers. They're battery sellers more than anything else. Anyways, I'm ranting. I'm rambling. So I did want to pass on a few of the tips and tricks that I've learned along the ways about starters, what I've encountered, what's worked for me, all that sort of business. Let me know, have you encountered anything special? What you do? You know, I love hearing other people's experiences, so leave a comment down below. I read them all that sort of thing. Try to respond to as many as I can. So yeah, let's get it started, right? What can you do? Anyways, as always, just want to say thanks for watching. We'll catch you on the next one. Bye for now.